On May 27, 1942, two men crouched behind a curve in a Prague street, their palms slick with sweat, their fingers wrapped around British-made weapons. They were waiting for a man whose briefcase might contain the fates of thousands. When the grenades finally flew and the bullets tore through the morning air, they weren't just killing one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany. They were potentially unleashing a flood of secrets that could reshape the war itself. But here's what almost no one asks. What happened to those secrets? Reinhard Heydrich didn't just carry documents. He collected leverage. He hoarded whispers and confessions, police reports and surveillance transcripts, compromising photographs and signed confessions. He built his empire on information that could destroy careers, end lives, and topple regimes. And when he died on that hospital bed 4 days after the attack, bleeding from shrapnel wounds that no surgeon could fully repair, all of that information disappeared. This is the story of the most dangerous filing cabinets in Europe, and why 80 years later we still don't know where they are. To understand what was lost, you first need to understand what Heydrich was. He wasn't a street brawler who rose through Nazi ranks on charisma alone. He was something far more unsettling, a bureaucrat of terror. Tall, blond, with a high-pitched voice that seemed at odds with his ruthless reputation, Heydrich orchestrated violence with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. He didn't need to bloody his own hands when he could simply sign a memo. By 1942, Heydrich held titles that read like a horror anthology. Chief of the Reich Security Main Office, Director of the Gestapo, Architect of the Final Solution, Acting Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia. Each position gave him access to information that others could only dream of possessing. But what made Heydrich truly dangerous wasn't just his official power. It was his obsession with knowing everything about everyone. He maintained what can only be described as a shadow archive. Files on fellow Nazi leaders, documenting their affairs, their financial irregularities, their private doubts about Hitler's strategy. Dossiers on industrialists who collaborated with the regime, complete with details that could prove collaboration or resistance depending on who won the war. Intelligence reports from occupied territories, resistance networks, partisan activities, the names of informants who thought their identities would remain forever secret. And then there were the files from his time running the Wannsee Conference, where the systematic murder of European Jewry was formally coordinated. Minutes from meetings, transportation schedules, kill ratios, the administrative paperwork of genocide. Heydrich understood something fundamental about power. Knowledge isn't just influence, it's insurance. In a regime where loyalty was performed but rarely felt, where everyone plotted against everyone else, information about your rivals was the only guarantee you'd see tomorrow. So he kept files. Lots of them. The attack itself happened with brutal efficiency. 2 Czech resistance fighters, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, trained in Britain and parachuted back into occupied Czechoslovakia, had been tracking Heydrich's movements for weeks. They learned his routines, his routes, the fact that he often traveled without significant security because he believed fear alone would protect him. They were wrong. When Gabčík's Sten gun jammed at the crucial moment, Kubiš threw a modified anti-tank grenade that exploded against the rear wheel of Heydrich's open-top Mercedes. Shrapnel tore through the car's interior, embedding fragments of upholstery, metal, and horsehair from the seat cushions deep into Heydrich's body. Heydrich staggered from the car, drew his pistol, actually managed to chase his attackers for a few steps before collapsing. He was rushed to a hospital where German doctors, fearing Hitler's wrath if they failed, performed emergency surgery. For days, Heydrich seemed to rally. Then sepsis set in. On June 4th, he slipped into a coma. Hours later, he was dead. Hitler was apoplectic. He ordered savage reprisals. The village of Lidice was erased from existence, every man executed, every woman sent to concentration camps, every building demolished. But amid the rage and the revenge, a quieter panic set in among certain Nazi officials. Where were Heydrich's files? Here's where the story fractures into competing narratives, each one frustratingly incomplete. The official version, such as it exists, suggests that Heydrich's personal office in Prague was secured immediately after his death. SS guards sealed the building. Nothing was to be removed without authorization from Berlin. Heinrich Himmler himself, Heydrich's superior and the head of the SS, traveled to Prague to personally oversee the inventory. But secured is a flexible word in the vocabulary of paranoid dictatorships. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing trucks arriving at Heydrich's residence and offices in the days following his death. Were they carrying files away for safekeeping? Or were they removing documents that powerful men preferred didn't reach Berlin? When everyone has secrets, and the man who knew them all suddenly dies, the scramble isn't to preserve information. It's to control what survives. Some documents certainly made it back to Berlin. We know this because fragments of Heydrich's security files occasionally surface in captured Nazi archives. A memo here, a surveillance report there, usually stamped with Heydrich's signature or the letterhead of his various offices. But these are scraps, not the systematic collection everyone knew he maintained. The more interesting question isn't what was saved, it's what was destroyed. Think about who had the most to lose if Heydrich's complete files became public. Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor, had accumulated wealth through corruption that would make modern oligarchs blush. Art stolen from Jewish families, bribes from industrialists, entire estates seized and transferred to his name. Heydrich knew every transaction. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, maintained a public image of Nazi moral purity while conducting numerous affairs and living in luxury that contradicted his own messaging. Heydrich had photographs. Even Heinrich Himmler, ostensibly Heydrich's patron, had reasons to fear. Heydrich was ambitious, ruthlessly so. Many believed he was positioning himself to eventually supplant Himmler. The files might have contained evidence of Himmler's own vulnerabilities, insurance Heydrich kept in case his superior ever moved against him. And that's just the Nazi leadership. Heydrich's intelligence network extended across occupied Europe. He knew which French officials collaborated enthusiastically versus which ones did so reluctantly. He knew which industrialists in neutral countries were selling to both sides. He knew which members of royal families across Europe harbored Nazi sympathies. For all these people, Heydrich's death wasn't a tragedy. It was an opportunity. The Czech resistance fighters who killed Heydrich were hunted relentlessly. They eventually died in a church in Prague, fighting to the last bullet against overwhelming SS forces. In the mythology that developed afterward, they were heroes who struck a blow against the Nazi occupation. But there's another angle that deserves consideration. British intelligence trained those men. British intelligence chose the target. The official reasoning was straightforward. Kill a high-ranking Nazi to demonstrate that no one was safe, boost Czech morale, prove that resistance was possible. But Heydrich wasn't just any high-ranking Nazi. He ran counterintelligence. He hunted spies. He was actively working to uncover British networks across Europe. And unlike many Nazi leaders whose competence was theatrical, Heydrich was genuinely good at his job. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Did British intelligence know about Heydrich's files? And if they did, was killing him partly about ensuring those files never made it to a war crimes tribunal? The British government has never declassified all documents related to Operation Anthropoid, the mission that killed Heydrich. Some files remain sealed, their contents classified even now. The official explanation is protection of intelligence methods. But methods from 1942? What exactly are they protecting? After the war ended, Allied intelligence services descended on Germany like archaeologists excavating a recently buried city. The Americans created Operation Paperclip, spiriting away rocket scientists and engineers. The Soviets grabbed entire factories and shipped them east. The British focused heavily on documents, particularly those related to intelligence operations. Massive Nazi archives were discovered. The files of the Reich Security Main Office, Heydrich's primary organization, were partially recovered from buildings in Berlin. Other caches turned up in salt mines, castle basements, and abandoned railway tunnels where desperate Nazis had hidden materials in the final chaotic months of the war. But the inventory was never complete. Allied officials who cataloged the recovered files noted conspicuous gaps. Personal dossiers on Nazi leaders that everyone knew existed were simply gone. Entire filing systems referenced in discovered documents were nowhere to be found. Lists of informants and collaborators across Europe vanished so thoroughly it was as if they never existed. The official explanation was simple: destroyed in the final collapse. Berlin was bombed repeatedly. Buildings burned. In the chaos of the Soviet advance, SS officers burned documents by the truckload rather than let them fall into enemy hands. All of which is certainly true, but it doesn't explain the specific pattern of what survived and what didn't. Here's what makes researchers suspicious. Low-level administrative files survived in surprising quantities: payroll records, building maintenance logs, supply requisitions. The mundane paperwork of bureaucracy endured because no one cared enough to destroy it. But the politically explosive material? Gone. It's possible this was simply logical triage. When you have limited time to destroy evidence, you prioritize burning the documents that could hang you. But it's also possible that certain files weren't destroyed at all. They were taken, hidden, preserved as leverage in a new world order. Consider what we know happened with other Nazi intelligence assets. Reinhard Heydrich, who ran Nazi intelligence operations against the Soviet Union, surrendered to the Americans with his entire archive intact. He made a deal, his knowledge and his networks, in exchange for protection and employment. The CIA took him up on it. He went on to run West German intelligence throughout the Cold War. If Heydrich could trade information for immunity, why not others? Multiple former Nazi intelligence officers ended up working for Western agencies after the war. They brought connections, experience, and presumably documentation that proved their value. Not all of them were prosecuted. Many lived comfortable lives in the new West Germany. What did they trade to earn that immunity? There are persistent rumors, impossible to fully verify, but equally impossible to dismiss, about documents surfacing in unexpected places. In the 1950s, several French politicians abruptly resigned from public life without explanation. Journalists at the time noted the timing coincided with anonymous letters circulating in Paris that supposedly contained information about wartime collaboration. The letters themselves never became public, but the implications were clear. Someone had receipts, and they were willing to use them. In the 1960s, a cache of documents reportedly appeared in a Swiss bank vault, unclaimed for decades. Swiss banking secrecy laws prevented any detailed inventory from becoming public, but sources close to the bank suggested the materials were German in origin and dealt with wartime intelligence matters. The vault was eventually cleared, but what happened to the contents remains unknown. Then there are the whispers about private collectors. The trade in Nazi memorabilia has always existed in a moral gray zone. Some collectors claim historical preservation. Others are motivated by darker sympathies. But among serious collectors, there's long been talk of documents that never appear at auction. Materials too sensitive to ever publicly surface. Files that prove collaboration, that name informants, that detail operations everyone agreed to forget. Are some of Heydrich's files sitting in a private collection somewhere? Insurance policies that turned into inheritance? Let's consider a specific example that illustrates what might be lost. We know from surviving documents that Heydrich maintained detailed files on the Catholic Church's activities within Nazi Germany and occupied territories. The relationship between the Vatican and the Nazi regime was complex, morally compromised, and marked by expedient cooperation alongside quiet resistance. Pope Pius XII's wartime actions remain controversial. Critics argue he didn't speak out forcefully enough against the Holocaust. Defenders cite secret efforts to shelter Jews and maintain channels of communication with the Allies. The full truth remains debated, partly because certain archives remained closed for decades. Now imagine Heydrich's files contain surveillance reports on Vatican officials, transcripts of intercepted communications, evidence of what exactly the Church knew and when, documentation of which officials helped and which looked away. Those files would rewrite our understanding of one of the most contentious questions in modern religious history. And they're gone? Or are they? The same logic applies to dozens of other historical questions that remain frustratingly unresolved. What did major corporations really know about forced labor in their factories? Heydrich administered the labor allocation systems. He would have known. Which scientists working on Allied projects had secret contacts with Nazi intelligence? Heydrich ran counterintelligence. He would have documentation. What exactly happened to looted art, gold, and assets that vanished in the final months of the war? Heydrich coordinated with the agencies responsible for confiscation. He would have kept records. The absence of these files doesn't just leave historical questions unanswered. It shaped the entire post-war order. Without documentation, suspected collaborators could reinvent themselves. War criminals who might have been prosecuted instead integrated back into society. Corporations that profited from slave labor paid modest fines and continued operating. The Nuremberg trials were groundbreaking, but they prosecuted a fraction of those involved in Nazi crimes. Part of the reason was evidentiary. Without complete documentation, prosecutors couldn't build cases. Without cases, there were no trials. Without trials, justice remained incomplete. But let's pull back and consider an even more unsettling possibility. What if some of these files were deliberately allowed to vanish because powerful people on the Allied side wanted them gone? The Cold War began before World War II even ended. By 1945, Western powers were already viewing the Soviet Union as the next enemy. Former Nazis with knowledge about the East became valuable assets overnight. This wasn't theoretical. It happened. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, was recruited by American intelligence and helped escape to South America. Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, worked for both Israeli and American interests after the war. Dozens of other former SS and Gestapo officers were quietly absorbed into Western intelligence networks. These recruitment decisions required overlooking considerable crimes. They required deciding that some information was more valuable than justice. Now imagine you're an American intelligence officer in 1945. You capture someone who claims to know where Heydrich's files are hidden. Those files document not just Nazi crimes, but also wartime collaboration across Europe. They name names. They provide proof. Do you immediately release that information, or do you realize that those files give you leverage over politicians, industrialists, and officials across Western Europe? Countries you need as allies against Stalin? Suddenly, those files aren't evidence for prosecution. They're tools for coercion. Suddenly, you have a very good reason to make sure they never see the inside of a courtroom. This is speculation, but it's informed speculation based on documented patterns of behavior. We know Allied intelligence services recruited former Nazis. We know they concealed information that might have led to prosecutions. We know they prioritized Cold War strategy over wartime justice in dozens of documented cases. Is it really so hard to believe they might have done the same with Heydrich's archive? The challenge is proving it. Intelligence agencies don't leave convenient paper trails of their most morally questionable decisions. Documents get reclassified. Witnesses die. Institutional memory fades. After 80 years, anyone directly involved is gone. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Let's consider what actually did survive and what that tells us. The fragments of Heydrich's files that turned up in captured archives are revealing precisely because of their limitations. They're almost exclusively operational documents, deployment orders, personnel assignments, routine surveillance reports. The kind of material that documents what happened, but not who authorized it or why. What's conspicuously absent are the strategic files, the policy discussions, the decision-making documents that would show which leaders knew what and when they approved it. Also missing, anything that would implicate specific individuals in neutral countries. During the war, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, and Turkey all maintained official neutrality while conducting business with both sides. Heydrich's intelligence network certainly operated in these countries, yet surviving files contain almost nothing about these operations. Why? One possibility is that neutral countries were particularly sensitive topics, and files related to them were destroyed first. But another possibility is that those files were too valuable to destroy. They documented the collaboration of countries that became important Western allies after the war. Spain under Franco, Portugal under Salazar, Turkey as NATO's eastern anchor, Switzerland as the banking center of the Western world. All of them had complicated relationships with Nazi Germany. All of them had secrets they preferred remained secret. There's a specific incident that illustrates how these dynamics played out. In 1947, a former SS officer named Wilhelm Huttle testified at Nuremberg. Huttle had worked in Heydrich's intelligence service and claimed to have personal knowledge of various operations. His testimony was useful to prosecutors, providing context and confirmation for other evidence. But Huttle was never prosecuted himself despite his own involvement in war crimes. Instead, he lived comfortably in Austria, wrote books, gave interviews, and maintained contacts with former colleagues. Why the special treatment? Huttle claimed in later interviews that he'd provided Allied intelligence with information about hidden Nazi assets and intelligence networks. He strongly implied he knew the locations of various hidden archives, though he never specified exactly what or where. Was this true, or was it a convenient story that kept him out of prison? We don't know because the relevant intelligence files remain classified. But the pattern is clear. Knowledge equaled leverage. People who claimed to know where materials were hidden could trade that information for immunity. And if you're an intelligence service, you have every incentive to keep those arrangements secret. Fast forward to the modern era, and the mystery takes on new dimensions. In recent years, researchers using advanced technology have discovered documents hidden in unexpected places. Microfilm concealed in furniture, papers sealed in walls, archives buried and forgotten. In 2000, a cache of documents related to looted art was discovered in archives that had supposedly been thoroughly searched decades earlier. In 2013, a massive collection of Nazi-era files turned up in a building in Prague that had been deemed empty. As recently as 2019, previously unknown documents about concentration camp operations surfaced in Russian archives. Each discovery raises the same question. What else is still out there? Archives are immense. Searching them thoroughly is nearly impossible. Documents get misfiled. Boxes get mislabeled. Material slips through cracks not because of conspiracy, but because of human error and institutional chaos. Which means it's entirely possible that portions of Heydrich's files still exist, sitting in some archive or collection, waiting for the right researcher to stumble across them. But that's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that the most important files were deliberately destroyed by people who knew exactly what they were burning. Imagine you're an SS officer in the final days of the war. The Allies are closing in. The regime is collapsing. You know that if certain documents survive, they'll hang you. But you also know that if you destroy everything, you lose leverage. So you make a calculation. You burn anything that directly incriminates you. But documents that implicate others, documents that prove collaboration by people in neutral countries or allied nations, documents that demonstrate widespread knowledge of crimes across European society. Those you hide, because after the war ends, those documents become valuable again. Insurance, blackmail material, or simply evidence you can trade for immunity. This isn't paranoid speculation. We have documented cases of Nazis hiding assets and information specifically to use as bargaining chips. The only question is whether any of Heydrich's files were part of that calculation. Let's examine one more angle that complicates this entire story. Heydrich wasn't the only one keeping secret files. Himmler had his own archive. Goebbels kept detailed diaries and records. Göring accumulated documentation on everyone around him. Hitler's chancellery maintained extensive files. The Gestapo, the SD, the Abwehr, every intelligence and security agency in the Third Reich created mountains of paperwork. After the war, all of these archives were supposedly captured, cataloged, and searched. But the sheer volume of material was overwhelming. Millions of pages, thousands of filing cabinets, entire warehouses full of documents. Allied personnel did their best, but comprehensive analysis of everything was simply impossible with 1940s technology and resources. Material was divided among different agencies. Americans took some, British took others. French and Soviets grabbed what they could. Files got separated from their original context. Cross-referencing became nearly impossible. In that chaos, Heydrich's specific files could have been dispersed, broken up, mixed into other collections. What might have been a coherent archive telling a specific story instead became isolated documents scattered across multiple countries and agencies. Which means researchers looking for Heydrich's files as a single collection are probably looking for something that no longer exists in that form. The information might still be out there. But finding it would require reconstructing which documents came from Heydrich's office, then tracking where each piece ended up across dozens of archives in multiple countries. No one's done that work. Maybe no one can. This brings us to the question of what it would mean if those files did surface today. For historians, it would be transformative. Complete documentation of Heydrich's activities would fill enormous gaps in our understanding of Nazi decision-making, the Holocaust's implementation, resistance, and collaboration across Europe, and the mechanics of intelligence operations. For families of victims and survivors, it might provide answers about what happened to loved ones, who was responsible, and how the machinery of genocide actually functioned at ground level. But it would also be deeply disruptive. Imagine documents emerged proving that a major corporation, still operating today, was far more complicit in war crimes than previously known, or that a prominent family's wealth came directly from confiscated assets, or that a government that postured as resistant actually collaborated extensively. There would be calls for accountability, reparations, prosecutions. But who would you prosecute? The people directly responsible are all dead. Modern institutions would argue they've already addressed historical wrongs. Governments would claim that revisiting the past destabilizes the present. The political will to truly reckon with these revelations might simply not exist. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe certain people don't want those files found. Not out of historical guilt, but because the present order is built on not asking certain questions. Let's talk about one specific mystery that Heydrich's files might resolve. The identity of informants within resistance movements. We know from surviving documents that Nazi intelligence penetrated resistance networks across Europe. They had sources inside partisan groups, in underground movements, within escape networks that helped Jews and Allied soldiers evade capture. Some informants were true believers in Nazi ideology. Others were coerced, their families threatened. Still others were simply paid. But their names, in most cases, were never fully documented in surviving records. After the war, resistance movements across Europe became foundational myths for national identity. France had its resistance. Poland had its underground state. Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, all built post-war identity partly on stories of resistance. But those movements were riddled with informants and collaborators. Everyone knew it at the time. After the war, there were waves of retribution, trials, executions. But without complete documentation, many informants escaped justice simply because their role couldn't be proven. Heydrich's files would have named them. All of them. Imagine what that would mean for national mythologies built on resistance. Imagine discovering that someone honored as a hero was actually an informant, that someone executed as a collaborator was actually innocent. Those revelations wouldn't just change historical understanding, they would upend family legacies, national narratives, entire conceptions of honor and betrayal. Do we actually want to know? This gets at something deeper about why certain historical mysteries persist. It's not always that we can't solve them. Sometimes it's that we choose not to. We decide, collectively, that some doors are better left closed, that some questions lead places we'd rather not go. The post-war order was built on selective forgetting. West Germany was reconstructed by people who'd lived under Nazism, some enthusiastically. European integration required countries to move past wartime betrayals and atrocities. The Cold War demanded alliances that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. All of that required not asking too many questions about what exactly everyone did between 1939 and 1945. Complete documentation would have made that forgetting impossible. So maybe, in a sense, losing Heydrich's files wasn't a tragedy. Maybe it was a choice, not a conscious conspiracy, but a collective decision that manifested through 1,000 individual acts of looking away. The officer who didn't search quite thoroughly enough. The bureaucrat who misfiled documents into obscurity. The official who classified materials that didn't really need classification. The researcher who decided not to push too hard for access. None of them individually making a decision to bury the truth, but all of them together ensuring it stayed buried. Today, the search for Heydrich's files continues in a quiet academic way. Researchers occasionally find fragments in archives. A memo surfaces here, a report there. Each discovery adds a small piece to the larger puzzle. But the central archive, if it ever existed as a single collection, remains lost. Some believe portions survived and are held in private collections, too sensitive to ever be publicly revealed. Others think materials are sitting in government archives, classified for reasons that have nothing to do with national security and everything to do with political convenience. A few optimists believe that advances in technology, artificial intelligence capable of cross-referencing vast document collections, might eventually reconstruct what was scattered. But most researchers familiar with the case have a different conclusion. The files are gone, not lost. Gone, destroyed, scattered, or hidden so well that finding them now is effectively impossible. And perhaps that was always the point. Think about what Heydrich represented. He was the bureaucrat of evil, the man who turned ideology into administration, who made mass murder a matter of paperwork and logistics. He proved that ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, filing forms and following procedures, could orchestrate horrors beyond imagination. His files documented that banality of evil in excruciating detail. They showed that genocide wasn't committed by monsters, but by civil servants who went home to their families each night. That collaboration wasn't just coerced, it was often willing, sometimes enthusiastic. That resistance was rarer than we'd like to believe. That most people, given the choice between safety and morality, chose safety. Those are uncomfortable truths. Our post-war mythology prefers clearer lines. Evil concentrated in a few leaders. Resistance more common than it was. Collaboration less willing than it actually was. Ordinary people better than they actually were. Heydrich's complete files would have made that mythology impossible to maintain. So maybe their disappearance serves a psychological need. We can tell ourselves that we don't really know how ordinary people behaved, that documentation is incomplete, that individual cases remain ambiguous. The file's absence lets us maintain doubt, and doubt in this case might be more comfortable than certainty. But here's what keeps researchers up at night. It's not just historical curiosity. It's not just academic completeness. It's the knowledge that those files documented specific crimes against specific people, names of victims, details of what happened to them, evidence that could provide closure to families who've spent generations not knowing. Every unsolved Holocaust case, every disappeared person whose fate remains unknown, every family still seeking answers about what happened to their relatives. Heydrich's files might hold those answers. And they're gone, or hidden, or moldering in some archive, waiting. So where does that leave us? With questions mostly. Did Heydrich's files survive his death? Almost certainly some of them did. Were they systematically destroyed in the final days of the war? Some definitely were. Did portions fall into Allied hands? Yes, fragments are documented. But the complete collection? The personal dossiers, the blackmail material, the comprehensive documentation of Nazi crimes and European collaboration? Gone. Either destroyed or hidden so effectively that 80 years of searching hasn't found them. And maybe that tells us something important. Maybe the absence of these files isn't a failure of history. Maybe it's a feature of how power actually works. Information this dangerous doesn't get lost by accident. It gets disappeared by people who understand that some knowledge is too explosive to exist. Heydrich collected secrets because secrets meant power. But after his death, those same secrets represented danger to everyone they implicated. And in a world suddenly committed to moving forward, to rebuilding, to forgetting just enough to function, those files became a problem. Problems that powerful people face tend to get solved. But here's the thing about buried secrets. They have a way of surfacing. Not always. Not usually. But sometimes. A researcher finds a misfiled document. A deathbed confession reveals a hiding place. Construction workers renovating an old building discover papers sealed in a wall. 80 years have passed since Heydrich's assassination. Everyone directly involved is dead. But documents, when preserved properly, can last centuries. So there's a non-zero chance that somewhere, in some forgotten vault or hidden cache, Heydrich's files still exist, waiting. Preserved by someone who thought they might someday be valuable, or by simple accident of history. If they ever surface, they'll rewrite what we know about the Nazi era, about collaboration and resistance, about who knew what and when they knew it. They'll answer questions that have haunted families for generations. They'll complicate narratives we've accepted as settled. They'll be, in other words, exactly what Heydrich intended them to be. Power, even from the grave. The story of Heydrich's files isn't really about documents. It's about the stories we tell ourselves after horror ends. About how societies decide what to remember and what to forget. About the bargains we make between justice and stability, between truth and comfort. Every missing file represents a choice, sometimes a deliberate choice to destroy evidence, sometimes a passive choice to not look too hard, sometimes just the chaos of history sweeping over everything, leaving fragments where once there was order. But the result is the same: incomplete knowledge, unanswered questions, mysteries that may never be solved. And in those gaps, we project our fears and hopes. We imagine what those files might reveal, and in imagining, we reveal ourselves. What we hope happened, what we fear happened, what we need to believe happened. The search for Heydrich's files continues, not because we expect to find them, but because the searching itself matters. It's how we acknowledge that the past isn't settled, that questions remain open, that we owe it to victims and survivors to keep looking for answers. Even if those answers, like the files themselves, remain forever just out of reach. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died in a Prague hospital. In the hours and days that followed, files disappeared. Some burned, some hidden, some spirited away to unknown locations by people whose names we'll never know. 80 years later, we're still looking, and maybe we always will be. Because some secrets are too important to stay buried forever, and some mysteries demand we keep asking questions, even when answers seem impossible. Heydrich is gone. His victims are gone. Almost everyone who lived through that era is gone. But somewhere, in some form, the truth exists. It always does. The question isn't whether it's out there. The question is whether we really want to find it, and what we'll do if we ever do. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.